His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer. Nobody called him that. The name he chose, Dutch Schultz, carried more weight on the streets of the Bronx than any birth certificate ever could. And by 1935, that name was on every front page in America. Some men are famous for what they did. Dutch Schultz was famous for what he got away with. This is a documentary retelling of verified historical events, where exact words are lost. Exchanges have been reconstructed from court records, testimony, and contemporaneous reporting. He was born in 1902 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. His father left when Arthur was 14. His mother ran a restaurant. His uncle ran a pool hall. Neither could hold him. By the time he was 17, he had been arrested for burglary. By the time he was 21, the Prohibition era had handed him something worth far more than a pool hall. It had handed him an empire. The Bronx beer trade in the 1920s was not subtle. Trucks moved at night, money moved in envelopes, judges moved on schedules. Dutch Schultz understood all three. He muscled into the illegal beer distribution business with a combination of violence and financial precision that most of his rivals could not match. Men who refused him were beaten. Men who still refused him did not get a third opportunity. By the early 1930s, he had expanded into Harlem. The numbers racket, the street lottery that ran through nearly every poor neighborhood in New York, was generating millions. The people running it were small operators. Dutch Schultz was not small. He moved into Harlem the same way he moved into the Bronx. With muscle, with money, with patience. And within 2 years, he controlled an operation that brought in somewhere between $20 million and $100 million a year. The man who ran it all was careful in specific ways and reckless in others. He wore cheap suits. He ate at diners. He did not buy yachts or penthouses. He did not throw parties. But he did order men killed. And he expected everyone around him to understand the difference between a business decision and a personal one. There was, for Dutch Schultz, rarely a difference. By 1933, the federal government had seen enough. The Internal Revenue Service had been watching his finances for years. They had done it to Al Capone in Chicago. They intended to do it again. A federal indictment for income tax evasion was filed against Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, in January of 1933. The charge was specific. The evidence was substantial. And Schultz ran. He spent more than a year as a fugitive, moving between safe houses, communicating through intermediaries, continuing to run his organization from wherever he happened to be sleeping that week. Law enforcement knew roughly where he was. Getting him was another matter. When he finally surrendered in November of 1934, he did so on his own terms, walking into a federal building in Albany with his lawyers beside him and his composure intact. The first trial was held in Syracuse, New York, in April of 1935. The prosecution believed the case was airtight. They had financial records, they had expert testimony, they had years of documentation. What they did not have, and what they could not fully anticipate, was the jury. After days of deliberation, the jury could not reach a verdict. A mistrial was declared. The government tried again. This time, the trial was moved to Malone, New York, a small town near the Canadian border, far from Schultz's base of influence in the city. The logic was obvious. A rural jury, unfamiliar with Schultz, untouched by his money, removed from the politics of New York City courts. It should have been a cleaner fight. It was not. What happened in Malone remains one of the more extraordinary episodes in the history of American organized crime trials. Schultz arrived weeks before the case began. He did not hide. He donated to local charities. He attended church. He introduced himself to shopkeepers. He made himself a neighbor. The prosecutor in the case was a man named Martin Conboy. Conboy was experienced. He was methodical. He believed the evidence spoke for itself. But the evidence was speaking to people who had spent the last several weeks watching Dutch Schultz hand money to the local Catholic church and wave to children on the street. Martin Conboy was not in the room for that part of the trial. The Malone jury deliberated for over 24 hours. A juror, speaking to reporters after the verdict, was asked how the panel had viewed the defendant.
He seemed like a decent enough fellow to us. Not what we expected.
The reporter pressed further.
We went by the evidence, that's all I'll say.
The verdict came back, not guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Schultz shook hands with his lawyers, smiled for the cameras, and walked out of the Malone courthouse a free man. It was August of 1935. He had beaten the federal government twice. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey had been watching. Dewey was 33 years old. He was meticulous, ambitious, and deeply unimpressed by the outcome in Malone. He had been appointed specifically to dismantle the organized crime operations that had taken root in New York City. And Dutch Schultz was near the top of his list. What Dewey began building after the Malone verdict was a new case. This one would not rely on tax records. It would rely on witnesses, on the numbers operation itself, on the women and men who ran the slips and collected the money and moved through Harlem every day. Dewey intended to take Schultz's empire apart from the inside. Schultz heard about it. He brought it to the commission, the governing council of the major organized crime families that had formed in the early 1930s. His proposal was direct.
Dewey has to go. We take him out now before he builds the case.
The room went quiet.
You touch a prosecutor in this city. Every cop in America comes down on all of us.
Lucky Luciano was not speaking out of sentiment. He was speaking out of arithmetic. The commission voted. Schultz's proposal was rejected. The decision reached across the table and across the city within days. If Dutch Schultz was going to move on Thomas Dewey anyway, the commission had a problem. And the commission, historically, solved its problems. On the night of October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He was meeting with several associates. He stepped away from the table briefly. Two men entered the restaurant. They were not there to eat. Three of Schultz's associates were shot at the table. Schultz himself was shot in the men's room. The bullet entered his side. It did not kill him immediately. He was taken to Newark City Hospital, where he remained conscious, barely, for nearly 22 hours. During those hours, he talked. A detective named Luke Conlon sat beside the bed and wrote down everything he said. What Schultz said in those final hours has become one of the stranger documents in American criminal history. He was delirious. He was in extraordinary pain. He moved between coherence and something else entirely. Detective Conlon recorded it all. Some of what Schultz said was name-dropping, people, places, old grievances. Some of it was prayer. Some of it was the kind of language that happens when the mind breaks loose from the body.
A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 Kim. So, mama, mama, mama. I want to pay. Let them leave me alone.
He died on October 24, 1935. He was 33 years old. The trial that Thomas Dewey had been building never happened. The case against Dutch Schultz, the one built on witness testimony and the numbers operation, died with him. But Dewey kept going. He would go on to prosecute Lucky Luciano the following year. He would become governor of New York. He would run for president of the United States twice. The man who was supposed to be the target outlived his would-be killer by decades. The Palace Chop House murders were eventually attributed to a team working for the Mangano crime family, acting on commission orders. The triggerman most often cited in historical accounts is Charles "Bug" Workman. Workman was convicted of the murder in 1941. He served 23 years. He was released in 1964. He said very little publicly. He outlived almost everyone involved. Dutch Schultz left behind an estate that was nearly impossible to account for. He had kept almost no records of his own finances, a habit that had helped him survive the tax trials and made life very difficult for everyone who came after. There are stories, persistent, unverified, almost certainly embellished, about a buried treasure somewhere in the Catskill Mountains. A strongbox, a fortune, hidden before the end came. No one has ever found it. Some people are still looking. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer. He chose a different name because he understood something that most men in his business missed. A name is a reputation. A reputation is power. Dutch Schultz spent his entire adult life building something that courts, prosecutors, and federal agents could not take from him. And in the end, it was not the law that brought him down. It was his own proposal, his own plan, his own voice in that room, saying the wrong thing to the wrong people. The last documented record of Dutch Schultz is Detective Luke Conlon's transcription of his final words. 22 hours of fragmented speech, names, numbers, prayers. The document is preserved. The questions it raises are not answered inside it. The file on Arthur Flegenheimer was closed on October 24, 1935. The city moved on. The machine kept running.